The Alien Enemies Act of 1798, it sounds like something from a history textbook, does it not? And it's not something most of us think about every day, but it's actually one of the oldest pieces of federal legislation still in effect. Originally passed during a period of high tension between the United States and France, the act was created to give the president extraordinary powers during wartime. Specifically, the ability to detain or deport citizens of an enemy nation. It has only been invoked a handful of times since its introduction, each instance tied closely to wartime crises like the War of 1812, World War I, and World War II. And here's where it gets, well, incredibly troubling. The application of this act in World War II led to the internment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans, many of whom were U.S. citizens. Families were forcibly removed from their homes, their businesses shuttered, their rights suspended under this wartime authority. We look back on that as one of the darkest chapters in our history, a decision fueled by fear, by racism, and by a disregard for civil liberties. Play this clip.
The 1988 Civil Liberties Act, which was signed into law by a president named Ronald Reagan. And that said that the internment of Japanese Americans in this country, which had been done under a law that dated back to the 1700s, a rarely used legal authority. That law signed by Ronald Reagan in 1988, the Civil Liberties Act, said that the internment of Japanese Americans had been based on racial prejudice and war hysteria and a failure of political leadership. 1988 Civil Liberties Act formally apologized on behalf of the United States of America to Japanese Americans for what we had done to them. And it paid them reparations just to try to make it right. The legal grounds for interning Japanese Americans in World War II was something called the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. That was only the third time it had ever been used in American history. It had been used in the War of 1812, it had been used in World War I, and it had been used for Japanese internment in World War II. Last night, we started to see headlines like this one at the Wall Street Journal, quote, "Trump to invoke seldom used wartime law from 1798. Or this one from CBS News. Professor says Trump's plan to invoke Alien Enemies Act of 1798 sidesteps immigration laws. And then, inevitably, because of the history of that law, we started to see last night headlines like this. From the ABC affiliate in San Diego, in this case, Japanese Americans react to Trump's plan to invoke Alien Enemies Act.
Yet here we are in 2025, and President Donald Trump has decided to, once again, dust off this centuries-old law. This time, though, the enemy is not a nation, but a gang, the Tren de Aragua, a Venezuelan prison gang. Trump has labeled them as conducting what he calls irregular warfare against the United States, likening their criminal activities to an invasion. It's an unprecedented claim. For one thing, this act was never meant to address criminal organizations. It was designed to confront enemy nations during declared wars. But what's even more far-reaching here is the administration's effort to redefine what constitutes an enemy combatant. By treating gang affiliation as equivalent to acts of war, the government is essentially pushing the boundaries of the law to new and, frankly, dangerous territory. What does this mean for due process? For civil liberties? For the rights of individuals who might be unfairly swept up in these broad accusations of criminal affiliation? Judge James Boasberg's restraining order. Just think about that for a moment. A federal judge took the extraordinary step of halting the deportations under President Trump's proclamation, even giving direct orders to turn flights around mid-air if necessary. These were flights carrying Venezuelan migrants, alleged members of the Tren de Aragua gang, and yet the government pressed forward. Did they pause, stop to consider the legal directive? No. Instead, they claimed it was already, too late, citing national security as their justification. And this is where it gets troubling. Imagine a judicial system where an executive branch can essentially shrug off a legal ruling simply because it is not convenient. That's what the Trump administration did here. They labeled the flights as outside the jurisdiction of the court, saying they had already crossed into international waters. But does that argument hold water? Pardon the pun, but judicial oversight exists for a reason, especially in matters as consequential as this. But here's what's even more concerning: the precedent this sets. If the executive branch can claim unilateral authority to override judicial decisions, particularly under the guise of national security, where does that leave the checks and balances within our governance? I mean, at what point does safeguarding national interests morph into something more authoritarian, more unilateral? Is this the balance of power the founding fathers envisioned? And let's dig deeper into the implications. These decisions don't just sideline judicial authority. They risk eroding public trust in the very institutions meant to protect our democracy. When executive actions bypass due process, who bears the brunt of these outcomes? Real human lives, families. Alleged affiliations alone shouldn't justify circumventing rights. That's a slippery slope, and one we've unfortunately seen before in history. 70 people to a cell, no mattresses, no recreation, no windows. Imagine, just for a moment, living like that. And we're not talking about hardened criminals here. Not always. We're talking about men, some of whom might be innocent Venezuelan migrants swept up under allegations with little to no evidence. This is the Terrorism Confinement Center, or CICOT, in El Salvador, a place where rehabilitation is non-existent and where the government explicitly acknowledges that these individuals will never return to their communities. The United States is paying $6 million for El Salvador to house alleged gang members in this mega prison. $6 million. And here's the kicker. It's being touted as a cost-effective solution to our own immigration challenges. But at what cost to human dignity, to justice, to our moral standing in the world? Financial savings cannot and should not be measured against the backdrop of human suffering. And then there's the geopolitical angle. President Nayib Bukele of El Salvador benefits politically from this arrangement, showcasing his government's tough on crime stance. But internally, Salvadorans are divided. Human rights advocates have decried the conditions at CICOT as inhumane, pointing to overcrowding, reports of abuse, and even deaths in custody. Are these the partnerships the United States should be fostering? Are we exporting our issues onto nations already grappling with their own deep-rooted challenges? Let's peel back another layer. The idea of labeling individuals as criminal insurgents or enemy combatants, lumping them under the broad banner of gang affiliation, it allows for sweeping actions with little accountability. And we've seen this before, haven't we? Policies like this generate collateral damage, innocent lives disrupted, families torn apart. Do we really think that punitive measures like these solve anything? Or do they just feed into an endless cycle of violence and instability? Here's my takeaway. Immigration policy isn't just about numbers and borders and national security. It's about us, our values, our humanity. We have to ask ourselves hard questions. Is it enough to say that protecting our borders justifies trampling on another person's rights? Can we, as a nation, stand by and watch while lives are destroyed under the guise of legality? Because, ultimately, these aren't just policies. They're people. They're lives. And if we let fear decide our moral compass, then what exactly are we fighting to protect? That wraps up today's episode of The Real 411. I want to personally thank each and every one of you for tuning in and for your continued support. It means more than you know. If you found value in today's discussion, please drop a comment, follow us on all social media platforms, and let us know what topics you'd like to see us cover next. Be sure to sign up for our email newsletter so you never miss an update or exclusive insight. And if you believe in independent media that digs deeper and dares to tell the truth, please consider following The Real 411 on Substack and Fanbase. We offer both free and paid subscriptions, and your support helps us continue producing content that informs, empowers, and sparks real conversation. Thanks again for being part of this journey, because remember, the story is never just the headline. Until next time, stay informed, stay bold, and stay real.